The fluorescent lights of the 24-hour diner cast harsh shadows across Marcus Thompson's weathered face as he nursed his third cup of black coffee. At 3:17 a.m., he was the only customer in Mel's diner on Highway 287, save for a trucker hunched over a plate of eggs at the counter. The waitress, a woman named Betty with kind eyes and silver hair, had stopped asking if he needed anything else around midnight. Marcus's hands, steady despite the caffeine, turned the ceramic mug in slow circles on the Formica table. The simple motion helped quiet the noise in his head, the sounds that followed him everywhere since his return from Kandahar 18 months ago. Car doors slamming became mortar rounds. The hiss of the coffee machine transformed into radio static from a convoy under fire. His phone buzzed against the table. A text from his brother Jake. "Still coming tomorrow?" The guys are excited to meet the legendary Marcus Thompson. Marcus almost smiled. Jake was 5 years younger, still active duty at Fort Hood, and possessed an optimism that military service hadn't yet weathered away. Tomorrow's shooting competition was Jake's idea, a way to get Marcus out of his apartment, away from the job applications that always seemed to lead nowhere, and the silence that had become his constant companion. The door chime announced another customer. An elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap shuffled in, nodding to Marcus with the subtle recognition that veterans shared. Marcus returned the nod, understanding passing between them without words. "More coffee, hun?" Betty appeared with the pot, her voice gentle. "Thanks." Marcus held out his cup. "You ever wonder why some people can't sleep?" Betty's expression softened. "My husband came back from Desert Storm with the same problem. Said the quiet was louder than the noise over there." Marcus looked up, studying her face. What did he do about it? Found his purpose again. Took time, but he started coaching Little League. Said helping those kids gave him something to focus on besides the memories. She paused, refilling his cup. "He's been sleeping better for 15 years now." After she walked away, Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Sarah's number. His 17-year-old daughter lived with her mother across town, and their conversations had become increasingly brief since the divorce. He typed and deleted several messages before settling on something simple. "Hey kiddo, hope you're sleeping better than your old man. Love you." He didn't expect a response at this hour, but his phone buzzed almost immediately. "Can't sleep either. Big chemistry test tomorrow. Maybe we both inherited the worry gene. Love you too, Dad." For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt something like hope stir in his chest. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe tomorrow would be good for him. Then the Texas sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Hood as Marcus pulled his battered Honda Civic into the visitor parking lot. The familiar sights and sounds of a military base, the geometric precision of the buildings, the distant sound of drill sergeants calling cadence, the snap of flags in the wind, brought back a flood of memories. Some good, some he'd rather forget. Jake was waiting at the gate, his Army ACUs crisp despite the heat, his smile as wide as Marcus remembered from their childhood. At 28, Jake had Marcus's same dark hair and brown eyes, but where Marcus carried the weight of combat in his shoulders, Jake still moved with the confidence of someone who believed the world made sense. "There's my big brother." Jake embraced Marcus with the kind of enthusiasm that made other soldiers stop and look. "Man, you look good. Have you been working out?" Marcus almost laughed. The security guard job required him to walk miles each night patrolling the industrial complex where he worked, but he wouldn't call it working out. Something like that. "You ready to watch me embarrass myself in front of your buddies?" "Are you kidding? I've been talking you up for weeks. Half these guys think I made you up." Jake led him toward a cluster of buildings near the firing range. 3 tours, expert marksman rating, that story about the sniper in Helmand Province. "Jake." Marcus's voice carried a warning edge. "Right, sorry. I know you don't like talking about that stuff." Jake's expression grew serious for a moment. "But Marcus, these guys need to see what real experience looks like. Half of them have never been deployed, and the ones who think they know everything because they did one tour in a quiet sector." They approached a group of about 20 soldiers, gathered around several shooting benches. The morning qualification rounds had ended, and now the informal competition was beginning. Marcus could see the mix of ages and ranks, some fresh-faced privates who looked like they'd graduated from high school last week, a few seasoned NCOs, and several lieutenants who carried themselves with the particular swagger of officers who'd never had their authority truly tested. "Everybody, I want you to meet my brother Marcus," Jake announced as they joined the group. Marine Corps, 3 tours in Afghanistan, expert marksman. A burly staff sergeant named Rodriguez stepped forward with a grin. Jake's been talking about you for weeks, man. Says you can put 5 rounds through the same hole at 300 yards. Jake exaggerates, Marcus said, but he shook Rodriguez's offered hand firmly. A young lieutenant with perfectly styled hair and the name tape, Morrison, interrupted. No offense to your service, sir, but that was 2 years ago. Different weapons, different training. These aren't insurgents with rusty AKs we're talking about. The group fell quiet. Marcus felt every eye on him, measuring his response. He'd encountered this before. Young soldiers who'd learned everything about combat from video games and training exercises, convinced that their modern equipment and fresh training made them superior to veterans of actual wars. You're absolutely right, Lieutenant, Marcus said calmly. Different weapons, different training. I'm sure you and your men are very well prepared. Jake looked concerned, recognizing the tone in his brother's voice. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow, sensing the tension but unsure of its source. Tell you what, Morrison continued, his voice carrying just enough condescension to make it clear he was showing off for his soldiers. Why don't you take a few shots? Show us how they did it in the old days. The words hung in the air like smoke from a misfired round. Marcus felt something shift inside him, not anger exactly, but a kind of calm focus he hadn't experienced since leaving the Marines. He looked at his brother, who was clearly torn between loyalty and embarrassment. I'd be happy to take a few shots, Marcus said quietly, but let's make it interesting. The firing range stretched out before them like a concrete altar to precision, with targets set at various distances from 50 to 500 yards. The afternoon heat shimmered off the asphalt, creating wavering mirages that would challenge even experienced shooters. Morrison had selected a standard M4 carbine for Marcus, the same weapon system the unit used for qualification, equipped with an ACOG scope and loaded with 5.56mm ammunition. Standard qualification course, Morrison announced to the gathered soldiers, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. 40 targets, prone supported, prone unsupported, kneeling and standing positions. Expert level is 36 hits. He paused, making eye contact with Marcus. Of course, that's with weapons we've been training on for months. Marcus accepted the rifle, his hands automatically performing the functions that had been drilled into him thousands of times. Chamber check, safety verification, sight alignment. The weapon felt familiar, despite being Army issue rather than Marine Corps, metal and polymer, precision engineering designed for one purpose. What makes it interesting? Asked Sergeant Rodriguez, genuine curiosity in his voice. Marcus looked up from the rifle. If I don't score expert level, I'll buy dinner for everyone here. If I do, he let the sentence hang. You won't, said a cocky private named Jenkins, barely old enough to shave. No offense, but this isn't some Taliban fighter with an old hunting rifle. This is precision shooting. Jake stepped forward, worry evident in his expression. Marcus, you don't have to prove anything to these guys. I know. Marcus's voice was calm, almost conversational. But I've been sitting in an apartment for 18 months, wondering if everything I learned over there matters anymore. Wondering if I matter anymore. He looked around at the faces watching him. Seems like a good time to find out. The first position was prone supported, firing at targets 300 yards away. Marcus settled behind the weapon with the fluid motion of someone who had spent countless hours in this exact position, often with lives depending on his accuracy. The concrete was hot against his elbows, the scope clear and bright in the afternoon sun. He fired his first shot. The range safety officer, a grizzled master sergeant named Williams, called through binoculars. Hit, center ring. The second shot followed immediately. Hit, center ring. By the fifth shot, the casual conversations among the watching soldiers had stopped entirely. Marcus was shooting with a rhythm that seemed almost mechanical. Breath, aim, squeeze, repeat. No wasted motion, no hesitation. All 5 center ring, Williams called out, and that's a perfect start. Morrison's confident expression began to shift. Lucky grouping. Let's see him do it without support. The prone, unsupported position was where most shooters began to struggle. Without the stability of a bipod or sandbag, maintaining accuracy required exceptional muscle control and breathing technique. Marcus transitioned smoothly, adjusting his body position with the unconscious precision of someone who had done this under far worse conditions than a Texas firing range. The watching soldiers had formed a semicircle behind the firing line, their initial skepticism replaced by focused attention. Even Jenkins, the cocky private, had stopped making comments and was studying Marcus's technique with the intensity of someone trying to learn. Marcus's breathing settled into the pattern he'd learned in sniper school. Inhale, exhale halfway, hold, fire during the natural respiratory pause when his body was most still. The first shot at 200 yards struck the target with a metallic ping that echoed across the range. "Center ring," called Williams. The second shot followed. "Center ring." By the time Marcus had completed the unsupported prone position, hitting all 10 targets in the center ring, Lieutenant Morrison had stopped talking entirely. The only sounds were the crack of the rifle, the ping of bullets striking targets, and Williams's steady calls. "Jesus," whispered one of the privates. "How is he doing that?" Sergeant Rodriguez had been in the army for 12 years and had seen plenty of good shooters. He'd never seen anyone maintain this level of consistency across multiple positions. "Experience," he said quietly. "Real experience." The kneeling position came next, 10 shots at 150 yards. This was where technique became crucial, where the body's natural instability had to be overcome through proper positioning and muscle memory. Marcus dropped into the kneeling supported position, left elbow braced against his left knee, right leg tucked under him for stability. Jake watched his brother with a mixture of pride and concern. He'd seen Marcus shoot before, during their hunting trips as teenagers, but this was different. This was Marcus accessing something that had been dormant since his return from Afghanistan. A level of focus and competence that made him seem like a different person entirely. The 10 shots in the kneeling position took less than 2 minutes, all center ring hits. 30 hits so far, Williams announced. "Standing position, 10 shots at 100 yards. The standing position was the great equalizer. Without any support except the shooter's own body, this was where even expert marksmen could struggle. The target seemed to dance in the scope, affected by heartbeat, breathing, and the smallest tremor of muscle fatigue. Marcus stood, adjusted the rifle's position against his shoulder, and took his first aimed shot. Center ring. Lieutenant Morrison looked around at his soldiers, realizing that his attempt to humble the veteran had backfired spectacularly. The men were watching Marcus with the kind of respect usually reserved for range instructors and combat veterans, which Morrison suddenly realized Marcus was. The final shot echoed across the range. "Center ring," Williams called. 40 for 40. Perfect score. The silence that followed was broken by Sergeant Rodriguez starting to clap. The sound was picked up by the other soldiers until the entire group was applauding, the kind of genuine respect that couldn't be commanded or faked. Marcus safed the weapon and handed it back to Morrison. "Good rifle," he said simply. "Your unit maintains their equipment well." Morrison, to his credit, extended his hand. "That was impressive, sir. I apologize for my earlier comments." Marcus shook his hand. "No apology necessary, Lieutenant. Confidence is important in a soldier. Just remember that experience isn't something you can get from a manual." As the group began to disperse, Jake approached his brother with a grin that threatened to split his face in half. "So, what was that about, wondering if you still matter?" Marcus looked around at the soldiers, many of whom were now discussing his technique and asking questions about combat shooting. For the first time in months, he felt something he'd almost forgotten, the sense that he had something valuable to offer. "Maybe I was asking the wrong question," he said. The drive back to Marcus's apartment should have been a victory lap, but instead, he found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter with each mile. The adrenaline from the shooting demonstration was wearing off, replaced by the familiar weight that settled on his chest whenever he had too much time to think. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Holy shit, Marcus. Morrison wants to know if you'd be interested in coming back next week to work with some of the newer guys. Rodriguez thinks you could help with their marksmanship program." Marcus pulled into the parking lot of his complex, a collection of identical beige buildings that housed mostly single people starting over, or never quite getting started. He sat in the car for several minutes, engine off, reading Jake's message over and over. The apartment felt smaller when he walked in, cramped with the accumulated weight of 18 months of unemployment, sleepless nights, and carefully maintained routines designed to fill time without requiring too much human interaction. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph. Marcus in dress blues at his promotion ceremony, flanked by Sarah and his ex-wife Linda, back when they'd still believed his military service was temporary. He opened his laptop and found 17 new emails in his job search folder. Rejections, mostly, though a few were automated responses thanking him for his interest. Security companies, police departments, private contractors, all looking for people with his skill set, but somehow never quite finding him suitable for their particular needs. The standardized language was always the same. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Never any specifics about why a Marine with expert ratings in multiple weapon systems, 3 combat deployments, and a clean record wasn't qualified to guard an office building or transport documents. Marcus closed the laptop and walked to his kitchen, where a bottle of bourbon sat on the counter next to an untouched dinner. He'd bought the bottle 3 months ago during a particularly dark week, then spent every day since proving to himself he didn't need it by leaving it unopened. Tonight felt different. His phone rang before he could make a decision he might regret. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Hey, kiddo," he answered, stepping away from the counter. "Dad, you sound weird. Are you okay?" His daughter's voice carried the particular clarity that came with growing up in a house where someone's moods had to be monitored carefully. "I'm fine. Just had an interesting day." Marcus settled into his one comfortable chair, a leather recliner that had been his single request during the divorce settlement. "How was your chemistry test?" "Brutal, but I think I passed. Mom said you went to Uncle Jake's base today. How did that go?" Marcus hesitated. How did he explain what had happened? That for 2 hours he'd felt like himself again. That the respect in those young soldiers' eyes had made him remember what it felt like to be good at something that mattered. "I helped some soldiers with their shooting," he said finally. "That's awesome, Dad. See, I told you that you'd find something. You're always better when you're helping people." The simple observation hit him harder than he'd expected. When had his 17-year-old daughter become wiser than he was? "Sarah, can I ask you something?" "Sure. When you think about me, what do you think about? I mean, what kind of person am I to you?" The pause stretched long enough that Marcus wondered if the call had dropped. "Dad, you're the person who taught me how to change a tire when I was 12, because you said I should never have to depend on someone else to get me home safe. You're the guy who came to every school play, even when you were deployed and had to watch on video chat from Afghanistan. You're—" Her voice grew quieter. "You're the bravest person I know, but you've been scared of something ever since you came back, and I don't know how to help you with that." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "You help me just by being you, kiddo. Dad, whatever happened today, if it made you sound more like yourself, maybe you should do more of it." Verse Marquis. Marcus woke at 05:30 hours, his internal clock as precise as it had been during his active duty years. For the first time in months, he'd slept through the night without the dreams that usually brought him bolt upright at 0300, sweating and reaching for weapons that weren't there. He made coffee and sat at his small kitchen table with his laptop, but instead of opening his job search folder, he found himself researching marksmanship training programs. Fort Hood's website had a section about civilian contractors who worked with various training programs. The requirements were straightforward: relevant military experience, expert-level qualifications, and the ability to pass a background check. His phone buzzed with another text from Jake. "Seriously, Marcus, Morrison wasn't just being polite. They need someone who knows what they're doing. These kids are good, but they don't have anyone teaching them real-world application. Would you at least think about it?" Before he could lose his nerve, Marcus typed back, "What would it involve?" The response came immediately. 2 days a week, maybe 3. Help with advanced marksmanship training, maybe some combat shooting scenarios. It's contract work, so you'd keep your flexibility. And Marcus, you'd be saving lives. These guys are deploying in 6 months. Marcus stared at the message for a long time. Saving lives. He'd joined the Marines at 18 with dreams of heroism and adventure. But the reality of military service had taught him that heroism was usually just doing your job well when everything went wrong. The thought that his experience could help prepare young soldiers for what they might face overseas stirred something in him that had been dormant since his discharge. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in over a year. "Linda? It's Marcus. I know it's early, but I wanted to talk to you about something." His ex-wife's voice was cautious but not unfriendly. "Is everything okay? Sarah mentioned you went to Jake's base yesterday. I'm thinking about taking a job there, teaching marksmanship to soldiers who are about to deploy." He paused, trying to find the right words. I wanted you to know because it might mean I'm around military people again, dealing with deployment stuff. I know that worried you before." Linda was quiet for a moment. They divorced primarily because she couldn't handle the uncertainty of military life, the deployments, the late-night phone calls that might bring devastating news, the way Marcus would sometimes disappear into himself for days after losing someone in his unit. "Marcus, are you sure you're ready for that? Being around all those reminders?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But yesterday, when I was working with those soldiers, I felt useful for the first time since I got out. Like maybe all the stuff I learned over there was for something more than just surviving." "What does your therapist think?" Marcus hadn't told her that he'd stopped going to therapy 4 months ago, when the VA counselor had suggested that perhaps he needed to accept that military life was behind him and focus on civilian integration strategies. "We haven't discussed it yet," he said, which was technically true. "Marcus, if this is something you want to do, then I support you. But promise me you'll be careful, and promise me you'll keep talking to Sarah. She's been worried about you, even if she doesn't say it directly." After they hung up, Marcus sat with his coffee and watched the sun rise through his apartment window. Across the parking lot, people were beginning their daily routines, getting in cars, walking dogs, carrying coffee cups and laptop bags toward whatever purpose gave structure to their days. He opened his laptop and began composing an email to the civilian contractor office at Fort Hood. His fingers moved with more confidence than they had in months as he outlined his qualifications and experience. Expert marksman, combat veteran, 3 deployments, experienced training junior Marines in advanced shooting techniques. For the first time since his discharge, Marcus wasn't just applying for a job to pay bills. He was applying for a chance to matter again. 3 days later, Marcus found himself sitting across from Major Patricia Hayes, the officer in charge of Fort Hood's civilian contractor program. Her office was spartanly decorated, a few military awards on the wall, a photograph of soldiers in desert camouflage, and a coffee mug that read, "Lead, follow, or get out of the way." "Your service record is impressive, Mr. Thompson," Major Hayes said, reviewing the file on her desk. 3 tours, expert ratings across multiple weapon platforms, several commendations for training junior personnel. She looked up. "Lieutenant Morrison spoke very highly of your demonstration the other day." "I appreciate that, ma'am. However, I have to ask, there's an 18-month gap between your discharge and this application. What have you been doing during that time?" Marcus had prepared for this question, but it still made his chest tight. "Adjusting to civilian life, ma'am. I worked security positions while exploring long-term career options." Major Hayes nodded, but her expression suggested she understood more than his carefully worded response revealed. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to be direct with you. We need experienced instructors, but we also need people who are emotionally and psychologically prepared to work with soldiers who are heading into combat zones. Some of these kids are 19 years old and have never been shot at. They need to learn from someone who's been there, but they also need to learn from someone who's made peace with having been there." The silence stretched between them. Marcus could hear the sounds of the base beyond the office walls. Vehicles moving, distant voices, the rhythmic cadence of soldiers running in formation. Sounds that had once been the soundtrack to his daily life. "Ma'am, I won't pretend that coming home has been easy, but yesterday was the first time in 18 months that I felt like I had something valuable to contribute. Those soldiers deserve the best training we can give them, and I believe I can help provide that." Major Hayes studied him for a long moment. The position would start as 2 days per week, working primarily with soldiers scheduled to deploy in 6 months. Advanced marksmanship, combat shooting scenarios, maybe some basic sniper awareness training. You'd be working closely with Sergeant Rodriguez, who runs our marksmanship program. She slid a contract across the desk. "The pay isn't spectacular, but it comes with access to base facilities, including the gym and the PX. More importantly, you'd be working with soldiers who need what you have to offer." Marcus looked at the paperwork without picking it up. "Ma'am, can I ask why you're willing to take a chance on someone with an 18-month gap in employment?" Major Hayes leaned back in her chair. "Because I did 2 tours in Iraq, Mr. Thompson, and I know the difference between someone who's running from their service and someone who's trying to figure out how to honor it. Your demonstration the other day wasn't about showing off. It was about remembering who you are." She stood and extended her hand. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Thompson. Report to Sergeant Rodriguez Monday morning at 800. Walking back to his car, Marcus felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in months. He called Jake first, then Sarah, sharing the news with an enthusiasm that surprised him, but it was his third call that proved most difficult. Veterans Crisis Line. This is Maria. How can I help you today? Hi Maria, this is Marcus Thompson. I've called a few times over the past year. He paused, finding the words. I wanted to let someone know that I think I'm going to be okay. That's wonderful to hear, Marcus. What's changed? I found a way to make what happened over there mean something again. Monday morning, found Marcus standing outside Building 2847, watching soldiers move through their morning routines with the easy familiarity of people who belonged somewhere. He wore civilian clothes, khakis and a polo shirt, but carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd spent years in uniform. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at 7:55, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of smile that suggested he was genuinely pleased to see Marcus. Ready for this? Rodriguez asked, handing over one of the cups. As ready as I'll ever be. Good, because I've got 12 soldiers who think they know everything about shooting because they qualified expert on their basic course. Rodriguez led him toward the range complex. Half of them have never fired anything but pop-up targets at known distances. The other half think Call of Duty counts as combat training. They walked past several ranges where other units were conducting training. The familiar sounds of commands, weapon operations, and distant gunfire created a backdrop that was both comforting and slightly overwhelming for Marcus. What's the real situation with their deployment? Marcus asked. Rodriguez's expression grew serious. They're heading to Syria. Advisory role officially, but intelligence suggests they'll be working in areas where contact with hostile forces is likely. These kids need to know how to shoot when someone's shooting back. The 12 soldiers were waiting at the range, a mix of ranks from private to staff sergeant. Marcus recognized several faces from his demonstration, including Private Jenkins, who looked considerably more respectful than he had 3 days earlier. Listen up, Rodriguez called out. This is Marcus Thompson, our new marksmanship instructor. Some of you met him last week. He's here to teach you things that might save your life downrange. Marcus stepped forward, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that came with training soldiers. Good morning. Before we start shooting, I want to talk about the difference between qualification and preparation. He gestured toward the standard pop-up targets at the end of the range. Qualification teaches you to hit stationary targets at known distances under controlled conditions. That's important. You need those fundamentals. But combat shooting is different. You're shooting at people who are shooting back, often while you're moving, under stress, with adrenaline affecting your fine motor control. One of the privates raised his hand. So, how do we train for that here? Good question. We start with stress inoculation. Marcus picked up one of the M4 rifles from the rack. Who wants to demonstrate their qualification technique? Staff Sergeant Williams, the senior enlisted soldier in the group, stepped forward. I'll go. Marcus watched as Williams settled into a perfect prone supported position and fired 5 rounds at a target 300 meters away. All 5 shots hit the center ring, textbook shooting. Outstanding, Marcus said. Now do it again, but this time after you fire each shot, do 10 push-ups before firing the next one. Williams looked confused but complied. After 5 push-ups, his breathing was elevated. After 10, his hands were slightly unsteady. By the 4th shot, he was breathing hard, and his final shot hit the outer edge of the target. What happened? Marcus asked the group. His heart rate was up, said Jenkins. Made it harder to hold steady. Exactly. Now imagine that elevated heart rate comes from someone trying to kill you instead of from push-ups. Marcus looked around at the faces watching him. Combat shooting isn't about perfection. It's about maintaining effectiveness under imperfect conditions. He spent the next hour introducing concepts that weren't taught in basic training. Shooting while moving, engaging multiple targets, transitioning between positions under time pressure. The soldiers struggled initially, their qualification scores dropping as they adapted to the new challenges. This is frustrating, one of the younger privates muttered after missing several shots during a moving drill. Marcus overheard him. What's your name, soldier? Private Cooper, sir. Private Cooper, in Helmand Province. I once had to engage 3 enemy fighters while running uphill carrying a wounded Marine. I missed my first 4 shots because I was trying to shoot the way I'd been taught on the range instead of adapting to the situation. Marcus's voice was matter-of-fact, without drama. The difference between frustration and funeral is learning to hit your target when everything's going wrong. The range fell quiet. These soldiers had heard war stories before, but there was something in Marcus's tone that made it clear this wasn't entertainment. It was education. "So what do we do?" Cooper asked. Marcus smiled for the first time that morning. "We practice until being effective under stress becomes as automatic as breathing. And then we practice some more." As the morning session ended and the soldiers cleaned their weapons, Rodriguez approached Marcus. "How do you feel?" Marcus watched the soldiers discussing the training among themselves, several of them practicing the new shooting positions they'd learned. "Like I'm home." 2 weeks into his new role, Marcus had established a routine that brought structure back to his days. Tuesday and Thursday mornings at Fort Hood, working with soldiers who were beginning to show real improvement in their combat shooting skills. The rest of his time was spent developing training scenarios, maintaining his own skills, and slowly rebuilding relationships he'd let deteriorate during his months of isolation. But progress wasn't linear, and Marcus was about to be reminded that healing rarely happened without setbacks. It started with a phone call at 2:30 a.m. on a Wednesday night. Marcus jerked awake, instantly alert in the way that never fully left combat veterans. "Marcus," Jake's voice was strained, barely controlled. "I need you to come to the base, now." "What happened?" "There's been an incident. One of your students, Private Cooper. He's dead, Marcus." The drive to Fort Hood passed in a blur of streetlights and empty roads. Marcus's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was racing through the possibilities. Training accident? Vehicle collision? The statistics were grim. More soldiers died from accidents, suicides, and training mishaps than from enemy action. Jake met him at the gate, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by the hollow expression Marcus recognized from his own mirror during the worst days overseas. "What happened?" Marcus asked as they walked toward the barracks area. "Suicide. His roommate found him around midnight." Jake's voice was flat, professional, the tone soldiers used when discussing casualties to maintain emotional distance. Left a note saying he couldn't handle the thought of deployment, couldn't live with the fear. Marcus stopped walking. Jesus Christ. Gets worse. The note mentioned the combat training, said it made everything too real. Some of the other soldiers are talking, wondering if the stress training pushed him over the edge. They stood in the darkness outside Cooper's barracks, watching military police and chaplains move with the grim efficiency that surrounded military deaths. Marcus felt the familiar weight settling on his chest, the weight of responsibility for decisions that couldn't be undone. "I need to see his squad," Marcus said. "Marcus, maybe that's not—" "I need to see them, Jake." The remaining 11 soldiers were gathered in a common area, supervised by Sergeant Rodriguez and a chaplain. Their faces showed the particular mix of shock and grief that came with losing someone from their unit. Private Jenkins looked up when Marcus entered, his eyes red but accusatory. "This is your fault," Jenkins said, his voice barely controlled. "All that talk about people trying to kill us, about being ready for combat. You scared him to death." The room fell silent. Rodriguez moved toward Jenkins, but Marcus held up a hand. "You're right," Marcus said quietly. "I did talk about combat, about the realities of what you might face overseas, and Cooper died because of it." Jenkins stood up, anger radiating from him. "So what are you going to do about it? Stop the training? Pretend war is safe?" Marcus looked around the room at the faces watching him. Young soldiers trying to process the loss of a friend and the possibility that their training might have contributed to his death. "I'm going to tell you what I should have told Cooper, what I should have told all of you from the beginning." Marcus sat down heavily in one of the chairs. "Combat training isn't just about learning to shoot under stress. It's about learning to manage fear, to function despite it, and to ask for help when the weight becomes too much." He looked directly at Jenkins. Cooper was scared, and instead of addressing that fear, I gave him more reasons to be frightened. "That's on me." "So what now?" asked Staff Sergeant Williams, the senior soldier in the group. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his conversation with Sarah, about Major Hayes's question regarding whether he'd made peace with his service, about the young soldiers looking to him for guidance. "Now we do better," he said finally. "We train for combat, but we also train for the mental challenge of facing combat. We learn to shoot under stress, but we also learn to recognize when stress is becoming something we can't handle alone." One of the quieter soldiers, Specialist Martinez, spoke up. "How do we do that?" Marcus looked around the room. "By talking about fear instead of pretending it doesn't exist. By admitting that being scared doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. And by making sure everyone in this room knows that asking for help isn't failure, it's survival. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the same firing range where he'd first demonstrated his skills to a group of skeptical soldiers. But this time, he wasn't the one shooting. He was watching 11 soldiers, now veterans of a deployment to Syria, demonstrate what they'd learned. The memorial service for Private Cooper had been held at Fort Hood's main chapel, attended by hundreds of soldiers and family members. Cooper's parents had asked Marcus to speak, a request that had nearly broken him. Standing at the podium, looking out at a sea of uniforms and grief-stricken faces, he'd talked about the importance of mental health resources, about the need for soldiers to watch out for each other, and about how Cooper's death had changed the way combat training was conducted at Fort Hood. Now watching Jenkins, recently promoted to specialist, coach a new group of soldiers on stress shooting techniques, Marcus could see the impact of that tragedy. These weren't just better shooters, they were soldiers who understood that mental preparation was as important as marksmanship skills. "Looking good out there," Sergeant Rodriguez said, joining Marcus at the observation point. "Jenkins has turned into a hell of an instructor." "He learned the hard way that technical skills aren't enough," Marcus replied. They all did. The deployment to Syria had been challenging but successful. The unit had performed well in several engagements, with no casualties and effective completion of their advisory mission. More importantly, they'd returned with their mental health intact, having implemented peer support systems and regular check-ins that had become part of their unit culture. Sarah approached from behind them, wearing her high school graduation cap and gown. She'd insisted on coming to watch the training session before their celebratory dinner. "Dad, are you ready to go? Mum's waiting at the restaurant." Marcus looked at his daughter, 18 years old, accepted to college with a partial academic scholarship, confident in a way that reminded him of the best parts of himself. Their relationship had strengthened considerably over the past months, built on honest conversations about his struggles and her concerns. "Just a minute, kiddo." He turned to Rodriguez. "How's the new program working out?" "Better than expected. We've had 3 soldiers self-refer to mental health services in the past month, and Command is treating it as a positive indicator rather than a problem. The combat effectiveness scores are up, but more importantly, the soldiers trust each other enough to be honest about their concerns." Marcus nodded, watching as Jenkins demonstrated proper breathing techniques to a young private who was struggling with accuracy under stress. "Send me the quarterly reports when they're ready. I want to track the long-term outcomes." "Will do. And Marcus, thank you, not just for the training but for changing how we think about preparing soldiers for combat." As they walked toward the parking lot, Sarah linked her arm through his. "You know, I'm proud of you, Dad." "Proud of me for what?" "For figuring out how to turn something terrible into something good. Cooper's death was awful, but the way you used it to help other soldiers, that took courage." Marcus stopped walking and looked back at the range, where soldiers were still training in the fading afternoon light. "Cooper should be alive, kiddo. Nothing I do changes that." "No," Sarah agreed, "but you made sure his death meant something. That's not the same as fixing it, but it's important." That evening at dinner with Sarah and Linda, Marcus found himself thinking about the conversation with Major Hayes 6 months earlier. She'd asked whether he'd made peace with his service, and he'd struggled to answer. Now watching his daughter laugh at one of Linda's stories while his ex-wife looked at him with something that might have been forgiveness, he thought he might finally understand what peace looked like. It wasn't forgetting the difficult parts or pretending they hadn't happened. It was finding a way to make them serve a purpose beyond survival. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "New group of soldiers starting next week. They're lucky to have you as an instructor." Marcus smiled and typed back, "They're lucky to have each other. I'm just here to help them figure that out." Under the table, he felt Sarah squeeze his hand. Outside, the Texas sun was setting over Fort Hood, casting long shadows across the base where young soldiers were learning not just how to fight, but how to support each other through the fear that came with serving their country. For the first time in 2 years, Marcus Thompson was exactly where he belonged.